Fear is supposed to be simple. You see danger, your body reacts, you run or fight. That's what they taught me in survival training, what every field manual confirms. Fear is clarity, the animal brain recognizing threat and responding. But that's not what I felt the night the storm came. My name is Daniel Carr, and for 11 years I lived alone in a cabin at 8,200 feet, deep in the Bitterroot Range of Montana, not as a warden or researcher, just as a man who'd walked away from a world that made too much noise. I built my shelter with my own hands, hauled water from a spring half a mile downslope, and learned to read weather in the color of the dawn sky. People called me a recluse. They weren't wrong. After my daughter died, after the hospital machines and the funeral and the endless well-meaning condolences, I needed silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something older, something that didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed. The mountains gave me that. I saw my first track in September of my second year. I was checking my trap line near Blodgett Creek when I found it pressed into soft mud beside the water, 17 inches long, proportioned like a human foot but broader, deeper, the toes splayed with the weight of something massive. I stared at it for a long time, my mind cycling through explanations. Bear, deformed elk, elaborate hoax by hikers with too much time and a sick sense of humor. But I knew tracks. I'd spent 30 years as a hunting guide before I disappeared into these mountains. And this was none of those things. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't out here to solve mysteries, I was out here to disappear. But over the next 3 years I kept finding them, always near water, always in places where the forest was thickest, where the canopy blocked the sky and the undergrowth grew dense and silent. And sometimes, in the stillness before dawn, I'd hear it, a sound like distant thunder, rhythmic and low, that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Wood knocking. That's what the old trappers called it. Communication, they said. Territory marking. I never investigated. I had my boundaries, and whatever lived up there had its own. Until the night of October 19th, when the storm rolled in, and I learned that fear isn't about recognizing danger. It's about recognizing when danger chooses to save you instead. Living alone at altitude teaches you humility. The mountains don't care about your plans, your experience, or your will to survive. They operate on their own schedule, and you either adapt or you die. My cabin was primitive by most standards. A single room, maybe 16 by 20 feet, built from lodge pole pine I'd felled and stripped myself. No electricity, no running water, no phone line. A wood stove for heat, a hand pump well I'd driven 50 feet into the aquifer, and a root cellar dug into the hillside where I stored venison, elk meat, and root vegetables. My routine was simple. I'd wake with first light, start the fire, boil coffee so strong it could strip paint. Then I'd check the weather, not with instruments but with observation, wind direction, cloud formation, the behavior of birds. A lifetime of hunting had taught me to read nature's signs better than any forecast. I'd spend mornings maintaining the property, splitting wood, repairing the roof, checking the spring line. Afternoons were for hunting or fishing depending on the season. Evenings I'd read by lamplight, mostly Thoreau, Muir, Leopold, men who'd understood what I was learning, that solitude isn't loneliness, it's clarity. The nearest human was Hank Morrison, a former logger who lived in a trailer about 12 miles southwest. We'd cross paths maybe twice a year, exchange nods, and move on. That was community enough. But I wasn't entirely alone. The tracks appeared with seasonal regularity. Spring, when snowmelt turned the high meadows into mud. Fall, when game moved to lower elevations. I found them near my spring along the game trails I used, once directly outside my cabin, pressed into the frost so fresh I could see the ridge patterns in the sole. Whatever it was, it knew I was here, and it was watching. I should have been frightened. Any rational person would be. But I felt something else, a strange sense of companionship, like I'd moved into someone else's territory, and instead of driving me out, they'd simply acknowledged my presence. I started leaving things. Not offerings. I didn't think of it that way. Just exchanges. An extra trout laid on a flat rock by the creek. Apples from my root cellar placed at the base of a marked tree. I'd check the next day and they'd be gone. No scattered remains. No signs of scavenger activity. Just taken. Once I found something in return. A bundle of eagle feathers, tied with braided grass, left on my chopping stump. The craftsmanship was crude but deliberate. Intentional. I hung them above my door. The old trapper's story started making more sense. They'd talked about the wild man of the woods, a creature that moved like smoke through the forest, that could throw boulders and snap trees but never harmed humans unless provoked. I'd dismissed those stories as folklore, the kind of mythology that grows in isolation. But folklore, I was learning, is just truth without documentation. By my 5th year in the mountains, I'd accepted what I couldn't prove. Something intelligent lived up here, something that existed in the margins between known and unknown. And whatever it was, it had decided I was acceptable. We had an understanding. I didn't pursue. It didn't threaten. We shared the mountain. The wood knocking became a comfort. I'd hear it in the evenings echoing from the ridgeline above my cabin. 3 or 4 measured strikes, always from the same general direction. I started knocking back. 2 strikes on the porch support beam. A pause, then 2 more. I don't know what I was saying. Maybe just I hear you. Maybe I'm still here. But the knocking would answer. And in that exchange, I found something I hadn't felt since before my daughter died. Connection. October came cold that year. By the 2nd week, I'd already had 2 significant snowfalls and the aspens had dropped their leaves early, always a sign of a hard winter ahead. I'd spent September stocking up, 2 elk in the root cellar, cords of split wood stacked under a tarp, dried beans and rice in sealed containers. I was ready for isolation. What I wasn't ready for was the storm. It started on October 18th with a pressure drop so severe my ears popped. The sky turned the color of old bruises and the wind shifted to the northwest, the direction that brings the worst weather into the Bitterroots. I spent the afternoon reinforcing the cabin, checking the roof seals, bringing in extra wood. By sunset, the first snow was falling. Not the gentle flakes of early season, but dense, wet snow that stuck to everything. Within an hour, visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet. I went to bed early, listening to the wind build against the cabin walls, telling myself I'd weathered worse storms. This was just another Montana winter showing its teeth. But around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my blood stop. Not wind, not snow, a low, sustained roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The cabin was shaking. The stovepipe rattled in its collar, and through the small window I could see nothing but white. A complete whiteout with snow moving horizontally, driven by winds I couldn't even estimate. Blizzard. A real one. The kind that buries cabins and kills anyone stupid enough to be caught outside. I got up, added wood to the stove, and tried to assess the situation. The wind was coming from the north, directly against the front wall. The cabin was solid, but it was designed for normal winter storms. Not this. If the wind got much stronger, if the snow accumulated too fast on the roof, I was just starting to calculate worst-case scenarios when I heard something over the roar of the storm. Wood knocking. 3 measured strikes. Close. Very close. And then, through the howling wind, another sound. Almost like a voice. Deep. Resonant. Urgent. Calling me outside. I'm not a superstitious man. 30 years of guiding hunters through wilderness taught me that nature operates on physics, not magic. Weather follows atmospheric patterns. Animals respond to stimuli. There's always a rational explanation. But standing in my cabin, listening to that sound, that call, cut through a blizzard that should have drowned out everything, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The hair on my arms stood up. I pulled on my parka, double-checked the laces on my boots, and grabbed my headlamp. The rational part of my brain was screaming that going outside in a whiteout was suicide. You can't see landmarks. You lose direction in seconds. People freeze to death 10 feet from their own front door because they can't find their way back. But that sound came again. Closer now. Insistent. I opened the door. The wind hit me like a physical blow, nearly knocking me backward into the cabin. Snow swirled in a disorienting maelstrom, my headlamp beam reflecting off a million flakes and creating a wall of white light. The temperature had to be near 0, with wind chill driving it far below. I couldn't see more than 5 feet. "Hello?" I shouted, immediately feeling ridiculous. My voice was torn away by the wind, inaudible even to me. But then I saw it. A shape in the snow. Massive, dark, standing maybe 20 feet from my cabin, barely visible through the blizzard. It was watching me. My body locked up. Every survival instinct I had was firing contradictory signals. Run. No. Don't move. Get back inside. No. Stay visible. This is a grizzly. No. Grizzlies don't stand like that. Not that tall. Not that still. The shape moved. Not toward me. To the side. Parallel to the cabin wall. Then it stopped. Turned back toward me. And I understood. It was trying to lead me somewhere. I should have slammed the door, should have barricaded myself inside, and waited for the storm to pass. But something in the way it moved, deliberate, patient, purposeful, overrode my fear. I stepped off the porch. The moment I left the shelter of the cabin, the full force of the blizzard hit me. Wind gusts that had to be 60, maybe 70 miles per hour. Snow so thick I couldn't tell if I was looking at the ground or the sky. Cold that bit through my parka like it was made of paper. I took 3 steps and lost sight of the cabin. Panic hit immediately. I spun, reaching for where the door should be, and saw nothing but white. The shape was gone too. I was alone in a void, already disoriented, already hypothermic. I was going to die. Then something touched my shoulder. Not grabbed, touched. Gently, firmly. And when I turned, there it was, right beside me. Close enough that I could make out details even through the snow. 8 feet tall, maybe more. Covered in dark hair, longer on the shoulders and back, matted with ice. The face was, God, the face. Not human, but not animal either. The brow heavy, the eyes deep set and dark, reflecting my headlamp like a deer's eyes but with something else behind them. Intelligence, awareness. It was looking at me, not like prey, not like a threat, like a person looking at another person who was about to do something incredibly stupid. It made a sound, low, almost a rumble, and gestured, a sweeping motion with one massive arm, directing me away from the cabin toward the tree line. Every rational thought I had said no. You don't follow unknown creatures into blizzards. You don't leave shelter during whiteout conditions. You don't trust something that shouldn't exist. But I'd been living on this mountain for 5 years. And for 5 years, this being had shared the space with me, had watched over me, had left gifts and taken offerings and knocked in the darkness like a neighbor checking in. I followed. It moved ahead of me, always staying just within sight, its massive form breaking the wind. I stayed close, using it as a windbreak, and realized with a start that I could breathe easier. The being was so large, so solid, that it created a pocket of calmer air in its wake. We moved through the forest, or I assumed we were moving through the forest. I couldn't see trees, couldn't see the ground, couldn't see anything except the dark shape ahead of me. Time became meaningless. We could have walked for 5 minutes or 50. Then the shape stopped, turned, and placed one enormous hand on my chest. Stop here. I stopped. It moved away, disappearing into the white. For a terrifying moment, I thought I'd been abandoned, left to freeze in the middle of nowhere. Then I heard sounds, wood splintering, branches breaking, the heavy impact of something massive moving with purpose. And suddenly I was out of the wind. My headlamp illuminated a space, a hollow beneath a massive fallen hemlock, the trunk creating a natural shelter. The being had cleared the entrance, had widened it, was now piling branches and debris to block the wind. It was building me a survival shelter. I crawled inside. The difference was immediate and profound. The roar of the storm became muted. The wind stopped tearing at my clothes. My headlamp showed a space maybe 6 feet deep and 4 feet high, cramped but dry, insulated by the massive log above and the snow already accumulating around it. The being crouched at the entrance, too large to fit inside. We looked at each other for a long moment, and I saw something in those deep-set eyes that I'll never forget. Not animal instinct, not primitive response, compassion. It reached out, and I flinched. I'm not proud of it. And gently, impossibly gently for something so massive, brushed snow off my shoulder. Then it stood, knocked 3 times on the fallen hemlock, and disappeared into the storm. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I huddled in that shelter for what felt like hours, listening to the blizzard rage outside, trying to process what had just happened. By dawn, the storm had passed. The silence after a blizzard is absolute. No wind, no bird calls, just the soft sound of settling snow and the occasional crack of an overburdened branch giving way. I crawled out of the shelter into a world transformed. 3 feet of new snow covered everything. The forest was unrecognizable. Familiar landmarks buried, trees bent under impossible weight. The landscape rendered alien and pristine. And my cabin was gone. Not destroyed. Gone. Buried under a massive snowdrift that had to be 15 feet high. If I'd stayed inside, I would have been entombed. The weight alone would have collapsed the roof. I'd have been trapped in darkness, crushed or suffocated, with no way to dig out. The thing in the storm had known. Somehow, it had known. It had saved my life. I stood there in waist-deep snow, staring at what should have been my grave, and felt something break open in my chest. Not fear, not gratitude exactly. Something bigger and more fundamental. The world was not what I thought it was. I'd spent my entire adult life believing I understood the boundaries of existence. Humans were the intelligent species. Everything else operated on instinct, stimulus response, evolutionary programming. We were separate, special, alone in our consciousness. But the being that had led me to safety, that had built me a shelter, that had touched my shoulder with a gentleness that spoke of empathy and understanding, that being had destroyed every assumption I'd built my worldview on. I wasn't alone on this mountain. I'd never been alone. And the thing I'd been living beside for 5 years wasn't an animal. It was a person. I spent that day digging, not toward the cabin. That was impossible without equipment, but toward the root cellar entrance, which was downslope and partially protected by the hillside. It took me 6 hours of brutal work, but I finally broke through to the wooden door and salvaged enough food and supplies to survive. Then I returned to the shelter beneath the hemlock and made it my temporary home. For 3 days I lived in that space, and every evening I'd hear it, the wood knocking, coming from the ridge above. 3 measured strikes, always the same pattern. I'm here. Are you still alive? And I'd knock back. 2 strikes on the hemlock trunk. Yes, I'm here. Thank you. On the 4th day, I found tracks. The storm had buried the old ones, but these were fresh, pressed into the new snow in a line leading from my buried cabin to the shelter. I followed them, measuring as I went. Stride length, 52 inches. Foot size, 18 inches. Depth suggesting weight over 700 pounds. The tracks led to a clearing I'd never found before. A natural amphitheater surrounded by old-growth cedar, where the canopy was so thick almost no snow had penetrated. In the center was a flat boulder, and on the boulder was an arrangement. Pine cones laid out in a spiral pattern, river stones stacked in a small cairn, and at the center, a bundle of winter berries, mountain ash, still bright red against the white. It was art, or ritual, or communication in a language I didn't speak. I approached slowly, reverently, and placed my own offering beside it, a wool blanket from my salvaged supplies. I didn't need it as much as I needed to say something, to respond to this gesture. Then I sat down in the snow and waited. The sun moved across the sky. Snow fell from branches in soft collapses. A Clark's nutcracker called from somewhere distant, and I waited. Just before dusk, I heard it. Not knocking this time. Breathing. Heavy. Measured. Calm. Coming from the tree line maybe 30 yards away. I didn't turn around. I'd learned over 5 years of peripheral encounters that direct eye contact felt aggressive, confrontational. Instead, I looked at the arrangement on the boulder and spoke quietly. I don't know if you understand me, I said. I don't know how much of our language makes sense to you, but I need you to know something. I paused, choosing my words carefully. You saved my life. That storm would have killed me. And you knew. Somehow you knew. And you came out in weather that should have killed you too, just to make sure I survived. The breathing continued. Steady. Close. I don't know what you are, I continued. I don't know if there are others like you or if you're alone up here, same as me. But I know you're real. And I know you're... I struggled for the word. Animal felt wrong. Creature felt dismissive. Monster was obscene. A person, I finished. You're a person. And I owe you everything. Silence. Then, from behind me, a sound I'll never forget. Low, resonant, almost melodic. Not a growl, not a vocalization like an ape. Something closer to a voice, deep and textured, with inflection that suggested meaning even though I couldn't understand the words. It was speaking to me. I closed my eyes, tears freezing on my face. I don't understand, I whispered, but I hear you. Another sound, softer this time, almost reassuring. Then footsteps in the snow, not approaching, leaving, moving away through the forest with surprising quietness for something so massive. I sat there until full dark, my body numb with cold, my mind reeling. When I finally stood and turned around, I found one more thing. Pressed into the snow where the being had been standing was a single perfect handprint, 4 fingers and an opposable thumb, proportioned like a human hand but scaled up, maybe twice the size. I placed my own hand beside it, my fingers barely reaching halfway across its palm. 2 hands, 2 species, 2 kinds of consciousness, reaching across a gap that shouldn't exist. That night I started writing. By firelight in my temporary shelter, I documented everything. Not for publication, not for proof, just to make sure that if I died up here, someone would eventually know. The world is stranger than we're told. Consciousness isn't unique to humans. And sometimes the unknown saves us from ourselves. Winter deepened and I remained on the mountain. I could have hiked out 12 miles to Hank Morrison's trailer, another 8 to the nearest town. I could have told someone about the buried cabin, filed an insurance claim, moved back to civilization. But I didn't, partly because I had everything I needed. The root cellar was intact, the spring still flowed, and the shelter beneath the hemlock, crude as it was, kept me alive. But mostly because leaving felt like abandonment, like breaking an unspoken covenant. I'd been saved, and that created obligation. I started observing more actively, not intrusively. I never pursued, never tracked aggressively, but I paid attention in ways I hadn't before. The placement of broken branches, the patterns of disturbed snow, the arrangement of stones near the spring. What I found suggested a life of remarkable sophistication. The being, I'd started thinking of him as the shepherd, though I couldn't say why, had infrastructure. Not architecture exactly, but intentional modification of the environment. Trees were bent and woven to create windbreaks. Boulders were arranged to direct water flow. There were clearings that showed signs of regular use, where snow was compressed in circular patterns suggesting something like sitting areas, and there was a pattern to his movements. He'd visit certain locations at certain times, the eastern ridge at dawn, the valley floor at dusk, the spring on clear afternoons. It wasn't random, it was routine, the behavior of someone who had a life, not just an existence. I found what I thought might be his primary shelter in late November, a massive blowdown, maybe 6 old-growth cedars that had fallen together in some long-ago storm, creating a naturally enclosed space beneath their tangled roots and trunks. The entrance was partially hidden by living branches, and inside the ground was thick with collected moss and dried grass, insulated, protected, carefully maintained. I didn't enter, but I left another gift, a tarp I'd salvaged, folded and placed just outside the entrance, a gesture of thanks, of respect. It was gone the next day. But with its disappearance came a question that started eating at me. What did I owe to the world? I'd witnessed something impossible, something that would revolutionize our understanding of evolution, consciousness, ecology. The existence of a large, intelligent hominid in North America, surviving undetected into the 21st century, was information that deserved to be shared, studied, protected through official channels. Every scientific principle I'd learned said this needed to be documented, reported, verified, but I'd also seen what happened when rare species were discovered. The swift foxes in Montana, tracked, collared, studied until they abandoned their dens from the stress. The wolverines in Glacier Park, monitored so aggressively that breeding rates dropped. Even with the best intentions, human observation changed behavior, disrupted life, transformed the wild into something curated. And this being wasn't a swift fox. This was someone who'd built shelter, arranged art, shown compassion. This was a consciousness that deserved privacy, agency, the right to remain unknown. I started having conversations with myself, arguing both sides out loud in my shelter at night. He could be the last of his kind. If he dies without documentation, we'll never know they existed. Or he's part of a breeding population that survived precisely because they've avoided us. Scientists could protect his habitat, create reserves, prevent development, or they'll tag him, study him, turn him into a research project, take away the one thing he has, freedom from human interference. You're being selfish. This isn't about your relationship with one individual. It's about knowledge. Whose knowledge? Who benefits? Not him, not his kind, just us, just human curiosity. The arguments went in circles, but underneath them was a deeper fear that by staying silent, I was choosing my own experience over collective understanding, that I was hoarding wonder. In January, I hiked down to Hank Morrison's place. It was the first human contact I'd had in 3 months. He was surprised to see me, but not overly curious. That was one of the things I appreciated about Hank. He didn't ask questions you weren't ready to answer. We shared coffee and venison, and I carefully steered the conversation toward local history, old trappers' stories, legends of the Bitterroots. You ever hear the ones about the wild man? Hank asked. a slight smile on his weathered face. Some. What do you know? My grandfather swore he saw one, back in '47, high up in the Clearwater drainage. Said it was bigger than any bear, walked on 2 legs, and watched him from across a canyon for near an hour. Never threatened, just watched. You believe him? Hank shrugged. My grandfather wasn't a liar, and he wasn't one for fancy stories. If he said he saw something, he saw something. He paused, refilling his cup. But I'll tell you what he told me. Some things are better left wild, better left unknown. Why? Because the world's got enough tame things in it, enough explained things, and if we can't let something be just because it is, without needing to own it, or study it, or put it in a zoo, well, then we've lost something important. I thought about that for a long time. Then I asked, if you saw one, if you knew for certain they existed, would you tell anyone? Hank looked at me with eyes that had spent 70 years in these mountains. You asking for a reason, Dan? I held his gaze. Hypothetically, he nodded slowly. Hypothetically, no, I wouldn't. Because the moment I did, it wouldn't be wild anymore. It'd be ours, and we destroy everything we claim to own. We finished our coffee in silence, and I hiked back up the mountain. But Hank's words followed me, settling into my bones like cold. That night, I heard the knocking. 3 strikes, from the familiar ridge, and for the first time I understood what it meant. Not I'm here. Are you still trustworthy? I knocked back. 2 strikes. Yes, I am. I promise. And I meant it. February brought clarity, both meteorological and personal. The weather stabilized into a pattern of cold, but manageable days. I'd excavated enough of the cabin to recover more supplies, though the structure itself was a loss. The roof had indeed collapsed under the snow weight, just as the shepherd had somehow known it would. I'd begun the slow process of building a new shelter, something sturdier and better positioned, and every few days I'd find help. Logs I'd never cut, already stripped and positioned near my building site. Stones arranged to form a foundation pad, once an entire section of wall framing, assembled with precision using wooden pegs instead of nails. The shepherd was helping me build. We never worked together. He'd do his work at night, or during the hours I was away gathering materials. But the collaboration was undeniable. I'd plan a structure, and he'd anticipate my needs. I'd struggle with a heavy timber, and by morning it would be moved into position. It was the most profound partnership I'd ever experienced, and we barely acknowledged each other's existence. But in March something changed. I was fishing at the spring. The ice had broken enough to access the deeper pools where trout overwintered, when I heard a sound that didn't belong, high-pitched, distressed, coming from the forest above me. I set down my rod and climbed toward the sound. It grew louder, more urgent. Definitely a vocalization, but not adult. Something younger, panicked. I found the source in a ravine about a quarter mile from the spring. A juvenile, maybe 4 feet tall, covered in lighter brown hair, proportioned like a child but clearly not human. It had fallen into a crevasse between 2 boulders, wedged in tight, one arm twisted at an angle that made me wince just looking at it. The juvenile saw me and made a sound. Sharp, frightened, defensive. It tried to pull away, which only wedged it tighter. Easy, I said quietly, keeping my distance. I'm not going to hurt you. The juvenile didn't understand my words, but something in my tone must have registered. It stopped struggling, just trembled there, breathing hard, watching me with huge, dark eyes that held too much fear. I didn't know what to do. Approach, and I'd terrify it further. Leave, and it might die of exposure or injury. And where was the shepherd? Where were this child's parents? As if summoned by my thoughts, I heard it. A roar from the forest, deep, primal, shaking the branches. The sound of a parent finding their child in danger. The shepherd burst into the ravine with a violence I'd never seen from him. He was massive in his fury, making himself larger, baring teeth I hadn't known he had, his entire body radiating threat. And he was looking at me. I raised my hand slowly, backing away. I didn't do this. I found him like this. I was trying to help. Another roar. He didn't care about my intentions. He saw a human near his injured child, and every instinct he had was screaming threat. I kept backing away, giving him space, showing submission in every gesture I could think of. I understand. He's yours. I'm leaving. But as I retreated, I saw the problem. The shepherd was too large to reach into the crevasse. His hands, his arms, they wouldn't fit. He tried desperately, but his bulk worked against him. And the juvenile was crying now, a sound that transcended species, pure pain and fear. I stopped backing away. "You can't reach him," I said quietly. "But I can." The shepherd turned those dark eyes on me, and I saw intelligence wrestling with instinct. Trust the human? Risk the child? I moved slowly, telegraphing every action. I took off my jacket, showing I was making myself vulnerable. I knelt at the edge of the crevasse, let him see my hands were empty. Then I looked at him directly, something I'd never done, and waited. He could kill me, easily. One blow would be enough, but he stepped aside. I crawled to the edge, assessed the situation. The juvenile was wedged about 5 feet down between rocks that compressed inward. I'd have to reach in blind, feel for the arm, and pull without causing more damage to what was likely already broken. "This is going to hurt him," I said, more to myself than the shepherd. "He's going to fight me, you need to understand that." I didn't know if he understood, but he didn't stop me. I reached in. The juvenile bit me immediately, a desperate, terrified snap that drew blood from my forearm. I didn't pull back. I found the small shoulder, the twisted arm, and as gently as I could began working it free. The juvenile screamed. The shepherd made a sound that nearly made me let go. Anguish, rage, helplessness all compressed into one vocalization. "I know," I whispered. "I know. Almost there." One more pull, a shift of angle, and the juvenile came free. I lifted him out of the crevasse, and immediately the shepherd was there, taking his child from me with a gentleness that contrasted shockingly with his earlier violence. He cradled the juvenile against his chest, examining the injury with fingers that moved with surprising dexterity. Then he looked at me, and in that look was something I'd never expected to see cross the species barrier: gratitude. He turned and carried his child into the forest, but before disappearing he stopped, set the juvenile down carefully, and returned to where I still knelt, bleeding and shaking. He reached out one massive hand and touched my injured arm, not roughly, not as threat. He touched the bite wound his child had made, and his expression, if I'm reading it right, and I believe I am, showed apology, regret, understanding that I'd been hurt trying to help. Then he was gone. I sat there for a long time, bleeding into the snow, understanding that I'd just crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. We weren't just sharing a mountain anymore. We were connected. The bite got infected. Not badly, but enough that after a week of trying to treat it myself, I had to make the decision I'd been avoiding. I needed to go to town. Hank drove me to Missoula in his pickup, asking no questions about how I'd gotten a bite wound that was clearly not from any normal animal. At the urgent care clinic, I claimed it was a dog attack, a stray I'd tried to help. The doctor cleaned it, prescribed antibiotics, and suggested a tetanus shot. "You live pretty remote," she said, wrapping the bandage. "Maybe consider getting a radio. Satellite phone, something. Next time might be more serious." "I'll think about it," I said, knowing I wouldn't. But that brief return to civilization shook something loose. In the waiting room, I'd picked up a magazine, National Geographic, and the cover story was about technology changing conservation. GPS collars, drone surveillance, AI analyzing wildlife behavior from camera trap data. It showed polar bears being tracked across the Arctic, jaguars being monitored in the Amazon, success stories about species brought back from the brink through active management and scientific intervention. And all I could think was, they'd do this to him, to his child. They'd call it conservation and turn their lives into data streams. Back at the cabin, or rather the half-built new cabin, I tried to settle back into routine, but something had shifted. I couldn't stop thinking about the juvenile, about the fear in those eyes, about the shepherd's desperate attempt to reach his injured child. They were a family, maybe the only family of their kind in hundreds of miles, vulnerable, isolated, dependent on staying hidden, and I was the only human who knew. In April, others arrived. I was hauling water from the spring when I heard voices, human voices, coming from the trail that technically ended 2 miles below my location, but that determined hikers sometimes pushed beyond. I intercepted them at the clearing where I'd first found the shepherd's stone arrangement. 2 men, early 30s, equipped with expensive gear and carrying what looked like audio recording equipment. "Private property," I said, stepping into their path. The taller one smiled. "Actually, we checked. This is national forest. Public access. Not up here. This is designated wilderness. No mechanized equipment allowed." I pointed at their gear. "This is research equipment. We have permits." He pulled out a folder, showed me official-looking papers. "We're with the Northern Rockies Cryptozoology Institute. We're conducting audio surveys for unidentified large mammals." My blood went cold. There's nothing up here but elk and bears. That's not what we've heard. The shorter one pulled out his phone, showed me a grainy photo. It looked like it had been taken from a distance, maybe with a telephoto lens. A dark shape among trees, indistinct, but large, upright. Where did you get that? Trail camera, down near Morrison's place. We've been monitoring reports from this area for 2 years. Multiple witnesses describing vocalizations, tree breaks, footprints. This is one of the hottest zones in Montana for Sasquatch activity. The word hung in the air like blasphemy. Sasquatch. They'd reduced the shepherd, this being of intelligence and compassion, to a cryptid, a mystery to be solved, a trophy to be documented. You need to leave, I said. We have every right to. I said leave. Now. Something in my tone must have convinced them I was serious. Or crazy. Either way, they exchanged glances, then began backing down the trail. We'll be back, the tall one called, with more people. You can't block public land. I watched them disappear, then immediately hiked to the shepherd's primary shelter. I didn't enter, but I left a new kind of offering. A note, written clearly, with simple pictographs alongside the words, "Danger, humans coming, hide." I didn't know if he could read. Didn't know if pictographs would translate across species, but I had to try. That night, I heard knocking. I'd never heard before. Not 3 measured strikes. A rapid staccato pattern. Urgent, alarmed, questioning. I knocked back a warning pattern of my own. Frantic tapping, trying to convey danger. The forest went silent. For 3 days, I saw no signs of the shepherd or his child. No tracks, no arrangements, no gifts. It was like they'd never existed, which was probably the point. They'd done this before, I realized, hidden when humans got too close. It was how they'd survived. But on the 4th day, I found something that made my decision for me. The researchers were back. 6 of them this time, with more equipment, setting up what looked like a base camp in the valley below my cabin. They had audio recorders, camera traps, even thermal imaging drones. And they had funding. I could see it in the quality of their gear, the professional way they operated. This wasn't amateur enthusiasm. This was a serious, organized attempt to document the shepherd's existence. I hiked down to their camp. They saw me coming and tensed. "I want to talk," I said, hands visible, non-threatening. The lead researcher, a woman this time, maybe 40, with the bearing of someone used to authority, nodded. "We're listening. What happens if you find what you're looking for? We document it, publish, work with federal agencies to establish protections. And the creature itself? We'd prefer non-invasive monitoring. Camera traps, audio, maybe DNA samples from hair or scat. No capture unless absolutely necessary for population assessment. But it would never be wild again, would it? It would be known, managed, owned." She studied me for a long moment. "You've seen it, haven't you?" I didn't answer. "Listen," she said, "I understand the impulse to protect. But if this species exists, it's probably endangered, maybe critically. Don't you think they deserve the protection that comes with scientific recognition? At what cost? You'll bring in researchers, students, camera crews. You'll map their movement patterns, analyze their behavior, and every moment of their existence will be observed, documented, studied. Is that life, or is that a cage made of attention? That's not your decision to make alone. Then whose is it? Yours? The government's? The creature itself doesn't get a vote?" We stared at each other, 2 humans arguing about the fate of a being that neither of us fully understood. "I can't stop you," I said finally, "but I'm asking you not to do this. Some things deserve to remain mysterious, and some things deserve to be protected." We'd reached an impasse, and I knew, with sickening certainty, that they weren't leaving. They stayed for 2 weeks. I monitored them constantly, watching from concealed positions, tracking their movements, trying to predict where they'd concentrate their efforts. The shepherd and his child remained hidden. I saw no evidence of them, heard no knocking. It was like they'd vanished completely, leaving behind only the mystery that the researchers were so desperately trying to solve. But I knew they were still there, watching, waiting, trusting me to keep them safe. On day 9, the researchers got their first evidence. A thermal drone caught something large and bipedal moving through a creek bed at dusk. The footage was brief, maybe 4 seconds, but clear enough that even I could see it was the shepherd. The camp erupted in excitement. They replayed the footage dozens of times, analyzing stride length, heat signature, proportions. They were certain they had documentation of an unknown primate species. "We need more," the lead researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen, said during a meeting I wasn't supposed to be listening to but could hear from my position in the trees above their camp. "One thermal clip isn't enough for publication. We need visual confirmation, multiple angles, scale references. What about trying to habituate it?" One of the younger researchers suggested. "Leave food, create a feeding station, if we can get it comfortable with human presence." "No," Dr. Chen's voice was sharp. "Feeding stations create dependency and alter natural behavior. We observe, we don't interact." At least they had that much ethics, I thought. But it didn't matter. The moment they published even preliminary findings, this area would be flooded. Amateur researchers, trophy hunters, curiosity seekers. The shepherd's world would end, not with violence, but with attention. On day 12, I made a decision. I hiked to the area where their best camera traps were positioned, a game trail the shepherd had used regularly before their arrival. I didn't disable the cameras. That would be too obvious. Instead, I altered the environment. I created new trails, more obvious ones, leading in directions away from where I knew the shepherd sheltered. I placed evidence. Hair samples I'd collected months ago, footprints I'd preserved in plaster and pressed into mud, in locations that would draw attention to the wrong areas. I was creating a false trail, a decoy, making the researchers chase shadows in the wrong direction. It bought time, but not enough. On day 14, something happened I hadn't anticipated. The juvenile appeared. I saw it happen on one of their monitor screens. I'd gotten bold enough to approach their equipment when they were all sleeping. The young one, maybe curious, maybe too inexperienced to know better, had wandered into camera range near the spring. The footage was extraordinary. Clear daylight, perfect angle, full body visible. The juvenile was playing, there was no other word for it, splashing in the water, examining stones, completely unaware it was being recorded. This was what they needed. Undeniable proof. A young Sasquatch captured in HD clarity. And they didn't know yet. The camera was set to record continuously, with the team reviewing footage each morning. They'd find this within hours. I had no choice. I stole the SD card. I waited until the pre-dawn hours when the researchers were in their deepest sleep, and I carefully extracted the card from the camera, replacing it with a blank one from their own supplies. Then I hiked back to my cabin and destroyed it, burned it, scattered the ashes. When the team discovered the missing footage, blank recording during the exact hours when something had triggered the motion sensor, they were devastated. Dr. Chen suspected equipment failure. The younger researcher suspected tampering but couldn't prove it. They lasted 3 more days. Then, with funding running low and results inconclusive, they packed up and left. But before they did, Dr. Chen found me. "You sabotaged our research," she said. Not a question, an accusation. I didn't deny it. "I protected something you would have destroyed by keeping vital information from the scientific community. Do you understand what you've done? If this species is real, if it exists in viable numbers, it needs protection. Official protection. And you've delayed that by years. Or I've given them years of freedom. Years of life without being watched and managed and studied. That's not your call to make. Then whose is it? Yours. You show up with your equipment and your funding and your certainty that you have the right to document anything you can find. But what about their rights? What about the right to exist without being known?" She stepped closer and I saw tears in her eyes. "I've dedicated my life to conservation, to understanding and protecting species before they disappear. And you're treating me like I'm the enemy. Because in this case, you are. You're the boundary they've successfully avoided for thousands of years. And I won't be the one who helps you cross it." "What if they're dying out?" she asked quietly. "What if this is a remnant population, inbreeding, facing genetic collapse? Don't they deserve help?" "Maybe. Or maybe the best help we can give them is to leave them alone." We stood there, 2 people who both believed they were right, who both thought they were protecting the same thing in completely opposite ways. Finally, she turned to leave, but she stopped, looked back. "If you're wrong, if they go extinct because no one knew to protect them, that's on you." "I know," I said. "I'll live with that." They left the next morning. That night, I heard the knocking, 3 measured strikes from the familiar ridge, and in response, from multiple directions, answering calls. Not just the shepherd, a family, maybe more than one, still there, still hidden, still free. I knocked twice on my cabin wall. "You're safe," I kept my promise, and the forest answered. That was 6 years ago. I'm still here, in my rebuilt cabin at 200 feet, sharing the mountain with beings that most people believe are myths. The researchers never came back, though I've seen their papers online. Preliminary thermal evidence of large bipedal fauna in the northern Rockies, carefully worded to avoid making claims they couldn't substantiate. The paper generated some interest in cryptozoology circles, but without that footage I destroyed, it faded into the background noise of Sasquatch claims. No one took it seriously enough to mount another expedition. The shepherd still visits. Less often now, he's older, I can see it in the way he moves. More careful, more deliberate, but he still knocks, still leaves arrangements, still occasionally accepts the offerings I leave. The juvenile, not a juvenile anymore, nearly adult size now, I see more frequently. He's less cautious than his father, more curious about me. Once we stood on opposite sides of the spring, just watching each other for nearly an hour. Not threatening, not friendly, just acknowledging. Two beings sharing space. That's all. That's enough. I'm 63 now. My knees hurt in the mornings, and my hands shake from old injuries and cold winters. I don't know how many more years I have on this mountain, but I know what I'll do with them. I'll keep the secret. I'll guard the boundary. And when I can't anymore, when age or injury or death finally takes me, I'll take the knowledge with me. Because I learned something in that storm, something that changed how I understand fear, protection, and wisdom. Fear isn't about recognizing danger. It's about recognizing what matters enough to protect, regardless of cost. For years I thought I was on this mountain to escape, to hide from a world that had taken my daughter and left me with nothing but grief. But I was wrong. I was here to learn a different way of being human, a way that respects boundaries, that honors mystery, that understands not everything needs to be named, known, cataloged. The shepherd taught me that, not through words, we've never spoken in any conventional sense, but through presence, through the gift of trust, through the profound act of allowing me to exist alongside him without demanding understanding. He saved my life, but more than that, he saved my humanity. In a world that treats everything as a resource to be exploited, a mystery to be solved, a commodity to be consumed, he showed me there's another path, the path of restraint, of humility, of acknowledging that some things are bigger than our need to know. I think about Dr. Chen sometimes, about her accusation that I'm preventing necessary protection, and maybe she's right. Maybe by keeping silent, I'm condemning the shepherd species to eventual extinction, to disappearing without anyone knowing they existed. But I've also seen what protection looks like in practice. The wolves reintroduced to Yellowstone, GPS collared, monitored every moment of their lives, killed when they ventured too close to livestock. The grizzlies in Glacier, managed, numbered, their genetics tracked like livestock breeding programs. That's not freedom. That's existence under surveillance. A wildlife reduced to data points. And the shepherd deserves more than that. His child deserves more. Whatever others of their kind remain in these mountains deserve more. They deserve the one thing we've taken from almost every other species on this planet, the right to be left alone. So I keep the secret. And the weight of it has changed over the years. It used to feel like burden, like I was hoarding something that should be shared. But now it feels like what it is: responsibility, sacred trust. The world isn't ready for beings like the shepherd. Maybe it never will be. And that's okay. Because readiness isn't a prerequisite for existence. They were here long before us, will hopefully be here long after, and don't need our understanding to validate their reality. I still think about fear, about what it means, about what I learned that night in the storm. I was afraid I'd die, afraid of the cold, the wind, the crushing weight of snow. Those were animal fears, survival fears, the kind that make sense. But when I followed the shepherd into the blizzard, when I let a being I didn't understand lead me into darkness, when I trusted something I couldn't explain, that was different fear, not the fear of death, the fear of being wrong, of trusting foolishly, of surrendering control. And in facing that fear, in choosing to trust, I learned what it means to be saved, not rescued from danger, but saved from the prison of my own certainty, from the arrogance of thinking I understood the boundaries of consciousness, of personhood, of what deserves protection and respect. The shepherd saved me from being the kind of human who sees mystery and immediately needs to expose it, who sees wildness and needs to tame it, who sees the other and needs to categorize it. He saved me by teaching me restraint, And now, in whatever time I have left, I practice that restraint. I live quietly. I observe without documenting. I protect through silence. Sometimes hikers stumble past my cabin and they ask about the stories, about the wild man, about whether I've seen anything unusual, and I smile and tell them what they want to hear. Just bears, just elk, just the mountain being what it's always been. They leave satisfied, having confirmed their assumption that the world is explained, mapped, understood. And after they're gone, I'll hear it. 3 measured knocks from the familiar ridge, and I'll knock back. 2 strikes. I'm still here. I'm still trustworthy. Your secret is safe. The wind moves through the pines. The creek runs cold and clear. And somewhere on this mountain, beings we don't have words for live their lives in peace. That's enough. More than enough. Some secrets aren't meant to be discovered. They're meant to be honored. And I'll honor this one until I can't anymore. Until the mountain takes me back and someone else, maybe no one, learns to listen the way I learned to listen. To hear what the forest teaches in silence. That the unknown isn't a problem to be solved. It's a gift to be protected.